What it was like to be rich throughout every era of history. The Stone Age. In the Stone Age, wealth was measured in terms of resources and survival capabilities almost solely. To be considered rich, one would need an abundance of essential resources such as food, tools, and materials for shelter and clothing, which at the time primarily consisted of wood, animal pelts, organic materials such as large leaves, and essentially sticks and dirt. Possessing skills in hunting, gathering, and toolmaking would also be extremely valuable. On top of that, forming strong social bonds and alliances within one's tribe or community would enhance access to resources and collective security. What this means is the more friends you had, the more people that you had to potentially help and protect you if things got wild, which back in the Stone Age, they did a lot. Accumulating and managing resources like animal hides for clothes, flint for tools, and a steady food supply through effective hunting and foraging were a key to thriving in this era, and was truly the key of becoming and staying rich or wealthy, which, if it isn't already obvious, just means to be alive. Your survival was your wealth, as that was all there was to look forward to. If you could survive another day and you had the resources to make it through that day successfully, you were well off. It goes without saying that there wasn't necessarily coinage in the Stone Age, at least not in the early Stone Age, and as far as the absolute origin of money, that is still something that is not fully known or understood. But during the Stone Age, possessing skills and having access to practical life-enabling resources was the pinnacle of wealth. During the Stone Age, if you had a cozy cave that you could call your own, you had a few pelts to wrap around your naked, hairy, stinky body, you had basic flint and obsidian tools to catch little critters, and you had a good group of friends that you could eat rocks with, you were set. But not just set, you were also wealthy. Just picture it now. Not a phone in sight. Just you, all of your best boys wearing small loincloths, hitting each other over the head with big wooden clubs, just being in the moment. Sounds pretty good to me. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron's age, the Bronze Age. Not to be confused with LeBron James, I'm talking about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age took place between 1330 BC and 1200 BC and signified a large leap in civilization for a few reasons, most notably the production of bronze. This era, while short compared to the Stone Age, which literally lasted millions of years, had significant technological advancements, which propelled society massively. If you're unfamiliar, all bronze is melted down tin with a larger amount of melted down copper. This alloy was easy to produce and readily available, and the production of this alloy and subsequently the tools made from it allowed for rapid development in both agriculture and warfare. With that being said, what did it look like to be rich, and how was wealth measured during the Bronze Age? During this time, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze. Being rich meant that you had access to these metal ores and the knowledge of crafting weapons, tools, and other ornaments. Trade became more prominent, so establishing strong trade networks and engaging in commerce was also a massive way to improve your wealth. These were some of the earliest economies ever. Additionally, owning agricultural land and livestock, which were crucial for food and trade, would signify wealth. Similar to the Stone Age, both of these are directly tied with life. Now, for almost the first time, social status was also playing a role with your wealth, with leaders often amassing wealth through tribe control over resources. So what exactly did it look like to be rich? Well, during the Bronze Age, we saw some of the earliest civilizations. So with that, we would see villages and larger communities living in one place. With that being said, if you were wealthy, you obviously had a nicer place or a larger place or potentially in a prime piece of the community, closer to the water or the farm. Besides that, we also saw irrigation agriculture, which basically means bringing the water to your crops. So if you were wealthy at this time, your farm that you had control or access to had an irrigation system built into it for convenience. And similar to the Bronze Age, if you had a good, strong network of people that you could trade with and access to tools and knowledge on how to build tools, you were pretty well off. Just imagine you and all your friends wearing slightly more animal pelts in a bigger group of people with a nice farm and a slightly bigger mud hut made with actual wood and nicer materials. You guys are all sitting around the forge making bronze swords and whatnot. Seems like a cool time. In ancient Sumeria during the Bronze Age, one of the earliest known currencies was actually grain. Grain was used as a popular method of trade. Besides grain, there has been some mysterious clay tokens that have been suspected to be used as a means of trade. And then as the Bronze Age continues, silver becomes a very popular means of currency, and then later after that, gold as well. So without getting too far into the weeds, during the Bronze Era, if you had a lot of social status, access to both land, agriculture, and animals, if you had a prime plot of of real estate, and you had a steady supply of bronze and you knew how to make good tools, you were really well off. And then on top of that, if you had a large supply of silver and gold, then you were rich. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a bit of an interesting era because at this point you might think that it was simply caused out of pure evolution and innovation, and up until this point everything's just been linear progress, but that's actually not the case. And during the Bronze Age, at least near the very end of the Bronze Age, there was multiple significant factors happening that caused a huge decline in production, literacy, trade routes, wealth, and overall progress for humans as a whole. And the very end of the Bronze Era and the beginning of the Iron Age was actually considered more or less of a dark time in humanity. The Bronze Age was more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of deal. And with the beginning of the Iron Age, we see almost more or less of a redo of the Bronze Age, but obviously with a new metal. We have iron, a much more valuable and a much stronger material. Following the same trend, however, the Iron Age was shorter than the Bronze Age simply because technological advancements took place quicker and humans were able to evolve more rapidly, even after the setbacks. With that being said, being wealthy in the Iron Age wasn't much different than being wealthy in the Bronze Age, as a lot of the same customs and traditions existed and the same means of production and wealth accumulation were in play. In the Iron Age, wealth was closely tied to the possession and production of iron, similar to bronze in the Bronze Age. Mastery of ironworking techniques to create durable tools and weapons provided a significant advantage to anyone looking to become truly wealthy. Rich individuals or communities would control iron deposits and forges, facilitating trade with military strength, either from their own community or even other communities. Agricultural advancements continued to be important, so owning and controlling fertile land and livestock remained to be a very prominent sign of wealth. Power and influence were also consolidated through warfare and alliances, with wealthy individuals holding positions of authority and accumulating wealth through tribute and trade. The Iron Age still yet didn't have coinage, and a lot of wealth was held in gold nuggets, gold sheets, gold ornaments, gold jewelry, fertile land, livestock, access to iron production, and access to military power and influence. The Medieval Era, aka the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. This era took place immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire, beginning in 476 AD and lasted for roughly 1,000 years until 1400 AD. During this time, wealth had become a lot more multifaceted and also more centralized on your connection with the powers that be. Besides the king and other royalty, the richest members of society in medieval times were the nobility and merchants. The richest of merchants were those who engaged in long-distance trade, specifically of luxury goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals, all of which were extreme signs of wealth. And although the levels of wealth between nobles varied quite significantly, the richest of nobles were those that controlled the most amount of land and had the closest connections to the monarch. Regardless of noble or merchant, at the top of each of these levels, life was pretty similar. These individuals would have their own dedicated castles, fully staffed with servants. They would have large estates and farms that would be maintained by peasants and serfs. They would have luxury goods such as expensive dyes, luxurious silk clothing, expensive gold jewelry, and access to an almost unlimited supply of food and entertainment of many varieties, if you catch my drift. On top of this, the richest in society also had access to great education, something that was still a large rarity for a majority of the population. This includes reading, writing, literature, and access to other scholarly texts. Now, with this being said, if you were rich in this time period, you had an amazing opportunity to live a life of leisure and luxury. But although that wasn't the case for many people, and the wealth gap during the Middle Ages was severe. Now, with that being said, it wasn't all fine and dandy for the rich of this time, because no matter what your financial status was during this time, you were still susceptible to disease, famine, and war. Just picture it. You're hanging out with all your boys. You're in your castle with torches everywhere. Your servant just brought you a big leg of lamb, and you all are drinking out of gem-encrusted solid gold goblets. You all cheers and spill wine on your expensive silk shirts, but you don't even care because you're so rich. You have a guy in a silly hat come do a dance for you, and then you go to bed and do it all again the next day. Seems pretty cool to me. But let's move on. The early modern era. Bros, we are getting extremely close to the modern era, but we're not quite there yet. We are currently in the early modern era, which takes place roughly from 1500 AD to 1800 AD. And this era of time is likely one of the most influential eras when it comes to the structure of the world that we live in today. Let me explain. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants and bankers accumulated wealth through the large global trade of goods like spices, textiles, textiles, and precious metals. The rise of capitalism and establishment of joint stock companies allowed for the pooling of resources and the sharing of risks and rewards. Owning land and engaging in agriculture still continued to be important, but the growing influence of commerce, finance, and manufacturing marked a significant shift on how wealth was perceived and earned in the early modern day. Up until this point, all it really took to be rich was having a cow, having a little bit of dirt to your name, and maybe a few shekels. Well, not even shekels, literally just bits of silver and having the right friends. But as we got into the early modern era, a lot of things seemed to change. We saw early globalization, early capitalism, early colonization, and the basis for the society that we all live in today. This was a pretty influential and pretty important 300-year run, in my opinion. And with that being said, what did it look like to be rich in the early modern era? Well, honestly, a lot more of the same. Bigger houses, more loot, more money, more connections, more food, more entertainment, bigger boats, more security. The biggest difference was the means of accumulating these resources. And if you were the type of person to be going on these conquests or voyages, then your life was extremely hectic, spending months or even years at sea to potentially come home empty-handed or never even come home at all. People were just playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag in real life. With that being said, everything was just sunshine and rainbows, right? Definitely not, like at all. But we're talking about being rich, so yeah, being rich was pretty awesome almost all the time. And in the early modern era, we saw for almost the first time how being wealthy started to shift. The modern era. And just like that, in the last 11.5 minutes, we went from millions of years ago in the Stone Age to the modern day. Now, the modern era is kind of blended into the early modern era, so there's no exact start date, but for the sake of this video, we'll consider it from 1800 until present day. In the modern era, wealth has been increasingly associated with industrialization, innovation, and finance. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies, creating vast fortunes for those who owned factories, mines, and railways. In the contemporary world, wealth is often derived from investments in technology, real estate, and financial markets. Entrepreneurs and business owners who innovate and scale their business can achieve substantial wealth. Education and knowledge has become a critical asset, and advanced degrees and specialized skills open doors to lucrative careers. Globalization and digital technologies such as the internet have further expanded opportunities for wealth creation across diverse sectors and regions. I would say that the world we live in today is pretty great, and we enjoy a lot of modern luxuries, and we have so many amazing opportunities right at our fingertips. Never before has the world been so decentralized, meaning that anybody has the opportunity to do great things. Whereas in the past, if you were a serf or a peasant working on a noble's farm, you had almost zero chance of being anything more than that. With that being said, in the modern day, especially as in present day, the amount of opportunities of getting wealthy thanks to the internet is almost limitless. But even at the beginning of the modern era, near the Industrial Revolution, opportunities were starting to present themselves everywhere. And obviously we got off to a rough start with extreme amounts of child labor, including chimney sweeps, factory workers, and a lot of horrible stuff that definitely isn't great, but got a lot of people rich. With that being said, what does it look like to be rich in the modern day? Well, fortunately, I don't think I have to paint too much of a crazy picture for you guys. And honestly, I think in the modern day, wealth is really what you make of it. Because of the vast amount of opportunities, it can be whatever you want it to be. If you have enough money to sustain yourself, then your wealth could look like living in a van that you own and have enough money coming in on a monthly basis to maintain your lifestyle. Or it could look like the biggest mansion full of the craziest watches and cars and gold doubloons. Now, for a generalization, the rich of today typically enjoy compounding interest with their investments, a good portfolio of real estate, freedom of time by having tasks delegated through their employees, and freedom of location and time, meaning that they can work where they want, when they want. That is, if they want to. Now, one thing I will say, bros, is that I just tried to sum up millions of years of history in under 15 minutes, so if something doesn't sound fully right, just remember, trust me, bro, what it was like to be poor in every time period. You guys absolutely loved my video about being rich in every time period, so I thought I'd cover the opposite. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The Stone Age is actually quite interesting when it comes to poverty, simply because some would argue that it really wasn't a thing, at least not in the way that we consider it to be now. In the Stone Age, hunter and gatherer tribes were not uncommon, and these tribes often had little to no material possessions as they were nomadic, meaning that they lived off the land and traveled where the land was abundant. For a majority of this time, the richness of individuals in the Stone Age came from the land that they inhabited, meaning that if you were in a lush, fruitful area, you were wealthy. If you had access to water, a safe place to live, some sort of shelter, and access to wild animals, you were rich. This also meant that the opposite was true. If the land that you were living in had no access to water, shelter was sparse, you were exposed and vulnerable to predators and the elements, and food was hard to come by, you were poor. very poor, dangerously poor. In the Stone Age, poverty was a life or death situation because your wealth was your livelihood. Your wealth was food, shelter, and water, the essentials to life. With that being said, in the Stone Age, these humans were extremely in tune with nature and they were skilled at finding lush lands. And typically tribes had routes that they would follow during different seasons or different times of the year. They would follow the migrations of animals and also follow water. This brings me back to my original point. Did poverty not exist in the Stone Age? I don't think so, but it definitely was different. And what it looked like to be poor in the Stone Age was basically living off of land that provided nothing for you. The soil was dry and barren. There was no water to be found. There was no shelter. Animals were hard to come by. And no matter where you looked or traveled, you could not find suitable land. And like I mentioned in the first video, being rich in every time period, the Stone Age did heavily depend on the group that you were in. So let's say your tribe abandoned you in this land that was not fruitful. Then you'd be really poor, aka dead. The Bronze Age. No, just kidding. Like I mentioned in the last video, the Bronze Age is where massive technological advancements started to take place, specifically the introduction of bronze, which is an alloy made of 88% copper and 12% tin, which is why we're showing copper on screen. During the Bronze Age, wealth was associated with the production and the control of bronze, the knowledge of being able to craft tools out of bronze, and also becoming active in trade with the bronze creations that you're making, whether they be tools, weapons, or ornaments. Societies were growing, and that meant trade was growing, and social status also started to show itself. Now, with this being said, what did it look like to be poor in the Bronze Age? Well, for starters, obviously you had no knowledge of tool creation whatsoever. You couldn't make a tool if you tried. You had absolutely no access to bronze or any sort of copper or tin deposits. You were not engaged in trade whatsoever, and you simply lived off of your own goods. Now, this actually brings me to an interesting point that I want to make, because it's important that we understand poverty within its cultural and historical context. What I mean by this is, sure, it's easy from us with a modern day perspective to look at somebody without resources or access to advanced tools or trade to be considered poor. But if we look at the context of the time, it is really not uncommon to be completely self-sufficient, and that was for the most part a way of life. Everyone made their own food, tended to their own farm, raised their own livestock, and being self-sufficient wasn't an option. It was a necessity. Although someone may appear to be impoverished because they don't have access to bronze during the Bronze Age, you could still live a great life if you were self-sufficient, built your own home, lived in a nice area, either near or far from society. It's just an interesting point, because what we would potentially consider being poor, somebody with no access to advanced technologies or trade, was actually more than fine. The people that we may label as poor in this time were doing completely fine and potentially even happier. Now, with that being said, if this person was really poor, and I mean really, really poor, they didn't have anything at all, meaning that not only did they have no tools, no skills, no access to bronze, they also didn't have any skills to make their own home. They didn't have a shelter to call their own. They couldn't live off of the land for whatever reason. And these people likely lived off of others and likely didn't live long either. At this point in time, being self-sufficient was very much a way of life. And if you couldn't take care of yourself, you weren't living long. The Iron Age. The Iron Age picks up where the Bronze Age left off, but with a new metal, iron. Iron was more readily available and also easier to forge and work with. Iron tools, weapons, and armor became the norm. And like the Bronze Age, association with the production, mining, and forging of this metal caused significant wealth, especially when paired with trade. Oh yeah, and in the Iron Age, trade, civilization, social class, and other factors all began to scale as well. Civilization was really starting to hit a stride here. And with this continued growth and scale of society, we saw the beginning of economics, employment, and a bit of what we would consider to be modern poverty. Being poor in the Iron Age typically meant you worked hard labor. You had basic living conditions and struggled to survive. Poor people in the Iron Age typically lived in simple, cramped huts made from wood, thatch, and mud, and their diet was relatively basic, consisting primarily of grains and vegetables, with meat being more or less of a luxury. Agriculture was still huge, but at this point, with employment now becoming the norm, these people were not working on their own farms, they worked on others' farms for a low wage. These impoverished people had long, demanding hours and wore clothes that were rudimentary and coarse. And like I mentioned, with the growth of society came more social status, and unfortunately, the poor got the short end of the stick there. The poor had low social status, limited rights, and were often heavily taxed by their local rulers. Now, despite all of the negatives in the life of the poor during the Iron Age, there was still a silver lining. Larger communities meant stronger community ties. There was more tradition that was being shared around, and religious practices also provided hope and support to those who lived these hard lives. You'll notice a trend of the more we see society evolve, we'll also see poverty become more common, because people are typically taken out of the self-sustaining lifestyle and put into a lifestyle where their livelihood is based off of working for others. This really makes you think, but I'll share my general consensus at the end of the video. The Middle Ages, or the medieval era. By this point, I think it's important we make another note. By modern standards, even the wealthiest of wealthy during the Middle Ages were not living amazing lives. The wealthy did, of course, enjoy better clothing, better housing, more food compared to the poor, but they had nowhere near the modern luxuries that a modern-day homeless person has access to. It's important to note that the Middle Ages was triggered by the fall of Rome, leaving a massive power vacuum and a huge opportunity for new management across all of Europe. And within that, two powers arose: the church and the royal families. I mention this because at the time, the centralization of power was very tight-knit, meaning that if you were not associated with the royal family or the church, your access to wealth was minimal, and almost everybody at this time was poor, or in context of the Middle Ages, a serf. And no, not internet surfing or the cool water surfing. No, we're talking about hard manual labor poverty surfing. Not fun. So to answer the question, what was it like to be poor in the Middle Ages? Well, kind of similar to before. You had limited legal rights, limited access to knowledge, limited freedom, limited resources. Your housing was small and pitiful. Your meals were barely sufficient. Your days consisted of hard manual labor, typically under the threat of violence if performance is subpar. And overall, it wasn't a great time. But like every part of history, if you have good friends, it can make a hard time an okay time. And just maybe, even a good time. Yeah, friendship is magic. Woo. Yeah, no, I don't know. It would suck to be poor then, for sure. The early modern era. As we discussed previously, in the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. We saw early globalization, economies grow, and we saw the development of the societies that we live in today. Life for the poor didn't shift much except for one interesting opportunity. Like the medieval era, in the early modern era, the poor still lived relatively similarly. Cramped, unsanitary conditions, limited access to proper housing and healthcare, basic diets consisting primarily of bread, grains, and very little meat. Poor people faced grueling, low-paying jobs in agriculture and manual work. Poor people had limited rights and were still taxed heavily. And at this point, still, education was scarce, perpetuating the socioeconomic disadvantages that they experienced. It's hard to do better if you don't know better, or even anything else. But similarly to before, in these hard times, these poor people had their boys, they had their religion, and now they also saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The society that they were living in was growing and expanding to the point where opportunities started to present themselves, and people started to have larger ambitions as they saw opportunities for themselves to level up their position in life and create just a little bit of wealth for themselves to enjoy some sort of modern comfort. Consider this early capitalism. Just picture it. You're hanging out with your boys. You just finished a 12-hour unpaid shift of getting your legs crushed by horses in the cornfields or whatever they did. And you guys are talking about religion and you're hanging out and you're drinking ale. And then all of a sudden one of your buddies says, hey, what if we go on one of these explorations? One of these guys is looking for crewmates on his ship and he wants to go colonize Madagascar. He says he wants to film a movie about talking animals from the zoo. That's what they had back then. At that point, that was a possibility, and the riches from that exploration and the profit from that movie, which did do well, could change their lives forever. The modern era and present day. If you want to see poverty in the present day, it's not hard to find. Simply open your phone, go to the camera app, and turn on the forward-facing camera, and there you go. You're looking at a poor person. Jokes aside, I would be lying if I said that the poverty experienced in the modern era is really much different than any other era. Now, of course, throughout history, access to information, medical care, housing, knowledge, and so many more factors have improved exponentially in the background, and this improvement has affected everybody positively. You know, a rising tide lifts all boats. But the experience that the poor people have always been similar. Limited rights, limited knowledge, limited opportunities, low wages, and a subpar experience, to say the least. One thing that I want to bring up that I kind of mentioned in the Stone Age is that in the modern day, poverty is really only associated with net worth and money that you have. But if you lived completely off grid, had everything you needed, and were self-sustaining, if you could support yourself, eat, live, do what you wanted to do on your own time, in your own land, and had $0 in the bank, would it matter? Would you need that money? Would that monetary wealth mean anything to you? If you think about it, the monetary wealth that we have today only is used as a tool to provide us with the luxuries we need to live. We pay for shelter, we pay for food, we pay for water, we pay for protection, we pay for infrastructure in the form of taxes. Wealth has always been about survival, and the only difference is how how survival looks with the development of society. I find it interesting that the introduction of poverty really only came around when we started to stray away from self-sufficiency and living off of the land and being independent as people. Now, I could be missing a ton of context, and this isn't necessarily a fact. This is just a theory I've come to as I've been making this video, but I really do find the concept fascinating that if you just live off the land, self-sustaining, poverty really doesn't exist because you are forced to live. That is your biological makeup. Think about the animal kingdom. There is no such thing as a poor animal. There's no measure of that. There's only an alive or a dead animal. It's interesting. Might be more of a shower or stoner thought, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about. If you haven't seen the Being Rich in Every Era video, check it out now. And if you want a quick summary of both videos, just for fun, here's the conclusion that I've come to. Wealth has always been about survival, and as it evolved, it transitioned to also include power. And I would still consider power to be part of survival, because not only are you surviving to stay alive, you're also trying to allow your power to survive. And on the other side of the coin, poverty has always been the same. Lack, severe lack of resources, lack of knowledge, lack of tools, lack of skill, lack of rights. But I think what I've learned over this video and the last is that to solve homelessness, what we need to do is give every homeless person access to Minecraft for, let's say, 2 weeks. Let them play Minecraft for 2 weeks, and then we'll just say, hey, now do this in real life and you'll be all right. Totally joking, but it's interesting to think that if you just have skills to be self-sustaining and live off land, money has no use. And yes, I know, well, how are you gonna get the land? How do you live off the land if you have no money, you have no land? Well, here's what we'll do. All the homeless people playing Minecraft, we're gonna live stream it. And the people that donate, that money will go towards buying the land, which we can allow them to plunder and build upon. Maybe not plunder, I think that's the wrong word, but live upon and bask and frolic, you know? Why not? I'm obviously being extremely satirical, and homelessness is a very complex issue that deals a lot with drug abuse and mental health, among other factors. But it's just a funny thought. Editor's note, but I read the comments. There's just so many timelines going on at once. I made this video as extremely general as possible. This is a Trust Me Bro video, not a documentary. What it was like to be famous in every time period. The Stone Age. The Stone Age is a cool and interesting time period where a lot of important events took place. But one thing the Stone Age is not known for is its celebrities. Specifically because celebrities didn't even exist back then. Neither did the concept of fame, at least not in a way that even closely resembles our modern understanding of it. But that's okay, because we're going to use our caveman brains to understand fame in the Stone Age. During the Stone Age, life was simple. Everything was based around survival. Humans typically existed in nomadic tribes, and your days were typically spent either chilling or surviving. With that being said, if you were a notable person in your tribe, you could potentially be considered famous. How could you become a notable person in your tribe? Being an exceptionally good hunter, runner, jumper, gatherer, or lover. Stories could be told to other tribes about these famous individuals to help spread their fame. And this early style of social status could potentially award these individuals perks like first dibs on the hunt, larger portions, mating benefits, and more. Now you might be thinking, yeah, that's interesting, but who are the most famous people from the Stone Age? And I'm going to tell you, and it's really quite interesting. The most famous people from the Stone Age were never famous in the Stone Age. They are famous in the modern day. How does this happen? It's because these people from the Stone Age had their bodies preserved from the Stone Age till the modern day. Carbon dating allowed us to pinpoint their age, and the fact that these bodies were so old was extremely notable in the scientific community, making these 5,000-year-old bodies way more notable than anybody ever was in the Stone Age. An example of one of these famous dead bodies is named Ötzi, also known as the Iceman. He is Europe's oldest known natural human mummy, and his body dates back over 5,000 years to the very end of the Stone Age. His body was discovered on September 19th, 1991 on the Austrian-Italy border in the Alps, and his body was so well preserved that they were able to almost identify everything about this individual and learn a lot about the Stone Age as a time period. His body is now one of the most researched bodies of all human history, and his unintentional mummification has been extremely helpful to scientific development. So yeah, if you want to be famous in the Stone Age, be a good hunter or something. But if you really want to be famous in the Stone Age, die high up in a mountain in the ice so your body will be preserved, and let people find it in a few thousand years. And if you really want to be famous, die in a funny pose on the top of a mountain. Honestly, living in a time where social status wasn't really a thing and it didn't matter so much sounds pretty good. Let's get over to the next time period. The Bronze Age, famous itself for its mass production and utilization of bronze. But we're not talking about the fame of the time period, we're talking about being famous in this time period, which fortunately is a little bit more exciting than being famous in the Stone Age. The Bronze Age not only represented development in technology, but also development in society. We went from stone tools to bronze tools, and from small tribes to massive empires. One of the most notable and famous empires being the Assyrians. A great example of a famous individual from this time period is Ashur I. He is known to be the first king of Assyria and is also considered to be the founder of Assyria as an independent city-state. Now, this isn't an Assyrian history lesson, but this is important context to the concept of fame in the time period. So let's get into it. What did it take to be famous during the Bronze Age? How did this fame become perpetuated and have lasting impact? And what benefits did you receive as a famous person in the Bronze Age? Well, for starters, becoming famous in the Bronze Age is a bit of an interesting concept because, like the Stone Age, Bronze Age fame wasn't a thing, at least not in a traditional sense. Fame was more or less of a byproduct of being a notable member in society, specifically a political influence or a leader, which is why Ashur was my pick for a famous example. He was a founding member of the Assyrian state and one of the first kings of Assyria. Pretty notable in my opinion, and definitely someone that people knew about. How was his fame perpetuated? Typically in this case through word of mouth, stories, and potentially even statues and temples in their name and honor. Now, as far as unique benefits from being famous in the Bronze Age, I want to kind of throw a wrench in this because consider this. Being famous in the Bronze Age typically came from political influence or being a highly powerful individual. So the benefits that you had in society weren't typically from the fame you had. The fame you had was because of the influence you had, and that influence you had is what brought you your great lifestyle. An example of this would be, sure, a king is well known and lived an amazing life, but is it because they're well known the fact that they lived an amazing life? No. If there was a bum on the street that everybody knew about because he was just always in the street doing crazy things, would he instantly live a better life because everyone knew him? No, that sort of attention brought them almost no gain and potentially would only bring them more misery, which may sound familiar to modern day times, but we'll get into that later. Whether the fame caused it or not, if you were famous during the Bronze Age, it was because you were a highly influential person, and because of that, you had the ability to live your life to the fullest and have everything that the Bronze Age was able to provide. The best housing, the best clothing, the best bronze tools, the best bronze ornaments, access to land, access to livestock, and if you were really notable, a temple or two. The Iron Age. Once again, new era of technological advancement, new era of civilization. This time it's the introduction and mass production of iron, a much easier to forge and find metal. Iron Age fame was relatively similar to Bronze Age fame, just at a slightly larger scale. Civilization was growing, empires were building, and in some cases rebuilding. And societies most famous in the Iron Age came from places of political power. Now, just to throw another wrench in the system, I will say this. Because I am focusing on society's most famous individuals, this doesn't mean that other notable society members didn't exist. Just the simple scale of their quote-unquote fame could not compare. Due to the nature of these societies being relatively centralized and not yet globalized, being a notable merchant or artist in your city or country could not compare to the level of notoriety that the leaders would have in their own empire and other empires. Quantifying fame is interesting, especially in time periods where it wasn't even really a thing. So definitely keep in mind that this is a trust me bro approach. Regardless of if these leaders were loved or feared, they were known. And a good example from the Iron Age is Boudica. No, not booty call. Boudica. She is actually badass. For context on how famous she was and how important her story was, they literally just made a movie about her story like last year. It's called Boudica, the Queen of War. And it's not like her story was just randomly dug up for this movie. No, her story has been told and held in high regard ever since her life. This is real notability and honestly goes far beyond fame. You might be asking, well, what does she do? Boudica is a significant figure in British history known specifically for her fierce resistance against the Roman occupation, which at the time was spreading quickly. But her fierce resistance against Roman forces united her tribe with other tribes such as the Celtics, which led to a significant rebellion. Her strategy, bravery in battle, determination, determination and fight for good made her a legendary figure among her people and the Celtics as well. Boudica stood for something, and to her people, she became a symbol of defiance against imperial power, and her legacy continues to inspire discussions about resistance, identity, and leadership to the modern day. Boudica stood for something, believed in it, and fought as hard as she could. That is respectable and also super cool. In short, being a queen made her famous, but being a badass made her an icon. The medieval era. Medieval times. Now this is something we can talk about. Think about castles. Knights in castles at night, mutton and ale. But let's focus on fame. If I asked you, who's your favorite famous person from the medieval era? If you're a history buff, you probably actually have an answer to this. And like the eras before this, your answer is probably somewhat tied to the royal family, social status, and something that's new to this era is the church. But during this period of time, other mediums of expression are becoming more popular, and therefore allowing notability to come from more than just your leadership within the community. Specifically, art and literature. Are these new or exclusive to the Middle Ages? Of course not. But significant development was made during this time period. A great example of an author famous for her literature during the medieval era is Anna Komnene. Ironically, she is a princess, but that wasn't her claim to fame. Due to her social status and access to knowledge, she was proficient in history, literature, philosophy, theology, maths, and medicine. Because of this, she was respected well by her peers. That, combined with her social status, would be enough to be quite famous in the time period, but this is only the beginning. She even ran an orphanage and a hospital with a combined head count of over 10,000, and she even taught medicine as well. But on top of all this, she is most well known for her writing the Alexiad, which simply put is a detailed breakdown of her dad's rule, specifically the Byzantine account of the First Crusade. So what were some unique benefits that famous literature composers could enjoy in the medieval era? Well, specifically patronage from the nobility and the church, which typically came in the form of financial support and social status as a byproduct of being associated with them. They also had special access to education, scholarly resources, allowing them to refine their craft. These composers often also held prestigious positions in royal courts or in religious institutions, gathering them influence and recognition. And additionally, and likely most importantly, the fact that their works were preserved through manuscripts, ensuring their legacy and impact on further generations. This is exactly how Anna's story was told and others like it. Of course, there's other ways you could be famous and other unique benefits of being famous, but for the sake of variety and keeping fresh stories for each time period, this is a pretty cool example in my opinion. The early modern era. Guys, I'm excited. We're getting extremely close to talking about the extreme value that TikTokers provide to society. But before we get to that, we must talk about the fame of the early modern era. If you watched the rich in every time period video or poor in every time period video, then you would know that in the early modern era, there was a lot of international trade, colonization, globalization happening. And for that reason, in those videos, in this time period specifically, I focused on conquests, travel, trades of luxurious goods. And for that reason, in this video, I want to take a different approach. I won't be talking about any famous or notable explorers. Instead, I'm going to be talking about artists. One famous artist in particular. You may know him. His name's William Shakespeare. By the time the early modern era came around, the significance of art in society was solidified, and the different mediums of art has grown exponentially. Shakespeare, for example, was a poet and playwright. He enjoyed considerable success and recognition during his lifetime, particularly in London, where he was an active member of the theater scene, and he was celebrated for his plays and poetry, which appealed to a broad audience, from royalty to commoners, which wasn't extremely common. Shakespeare's works were performed in prestigious venues like the Global Theater, and he got significant wealth from influential figures attending his plays, such as Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. His fame brought him riches and social status, allowing him to buy land and to secure a comfortable lifestyle. Despite the lack of modern media, he was able to still spread his message through his performances, printed plays, and word of mouth through anybody who saw one of his amazing shows. There is no doubt that William Shakespeare is one of the most famous and enduring playwrights of all time. So yeah, early modern era. A great way to get famous is plays or public performances in popular venues, printed materials such as books and pamphlets, and also getting as close as you can to the royal family, of course. The present day. We made it. We started all the way back in the Stone Age, and now we are here to the present day to talk about all the amazing celebrities that we have, because celebrities are a thing now, and some people are famous from being famous, and some people are rich from just being famous. It's a great and completely fair time. And since I've given an example of a famous person from every other time period, let me give you one for the present day. You're looking at it. Me, baby. Trust me, bro. The most famous stick figure in all the land. That's not true, because This guy still exists, but I'd like to think we're a notable stick. On a serious note, over history, things have become more and more decentralized, which is cool, and fame is not exempt from that, meaning that the ways that you can get famous now are seemingly endless, especially with the invention of the internet. Obviously, political leaders, religious leaders, and influential people of the such are still famous, but now there's a lot more ways to also become and stay famous, such as models, journalists, athletes, gamers, content creators, and more. Modern day celebrities enjoy a lot of luxuries, one of which being getting free things that they could already afford, special treatment in almost every scenario, and other cool stuff like that. But yeah, if you are curious about what fame looked like in every time period, let this serve as a very brief and extremely oversimplified explanation. What war was like in every time period. War and violence has been a timeless theme throughout human history, and although war never changes, some aspects of war do. Specifically, fighting styles, weapons, motivations, and other stuff like that. So today, let's learn why and how war evolved over time. The Stone Age. Technically, there isn't much evidence for war in the Stone Age, but I mean, come on. Does anyone think that humans who have been committing atrocities against each other for all of recorded history somehow all of a sudden were just peaches because they were cavemen? Like I said in the beginning of the video, war and violence is just part of the human condition. Thus, it's fair to assume that we still had wars before most of recorded history. And yes, that includes amongst cavemen. And I'm not just pulling this out of my cave, man. There's archaeological evidence for this. But first, what generally started wars in the Stone Age? Well, in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric people were thought to be nomadic, so they didn't really settle down and stay in one place. Because of this, there wasn't much of a reason to go to war. Resources weren't really seen as being one tribe or another tribe's possession, because in order to possess a river, for example, you'd have to live there and make sure that nobody else had access to it. However, in the Neolithic era, which is 10,000 BC to 2200 BC, tribes started to settle down into territories, which makes the potential for war breaking out much more probable in this time period. A lot of this remains speculation because there isn't enough evidence, but some of the proposed causes for war in the Stone Age would include disputes over territory, food, water, and even fights over women. I mean, think about it. If your average low IQ Chad is fighting his best friends over some random woman, imagine how an entire group of savage-ass mammoth-hunting cave gooners would behave. One terrible event that is speculated by historians to be caused by war is the Talheim Death Pit, which dates back to around 5000 BC. In this location, archaeologists found a pit filled with 34 bodies that looked like they were massacred. And if you include the outer ditch of the grave, there were 67 skeletons in total, all of which seem to have blunt force weapons used on their skull. In this site, researchers also found something that looks like a flat wooden paddle called a Thames beater. And no, cavemen weren't getting freaky with this thing. They used these glorified bonk sticks to baba booey their enemies into oblivion. Now, researchers have really only two theories about this event. One of them is that one village took over another to inhabit it. Another theory is that there was a small-scale civil war in the village, and just like Squid Game, the losers died. But they didn't just get their organs harvested here. The losers of this Stone Age battle ended up in a giant skeleton hole. And I'm not just talking about someone's freaky granny here. I'm talking about an enormous grave that looks like it was constructed for the Jolly Green Giant. Interestingly, only about 7 females aged 13 to 40 were found in the grave, which suggests that they may have been abducted. Besides the earlier weapons I mentioned, Neolithic fighters used axes and hammers made of wood, stone, and animal bones. Sometimes they even used farm tools that doubled as weapons. Talk about ingenuity. As we saw from the gravesite, Stone Age war was barbaric, brief, and brutal, and historians hypothesize they preferred guerrilla-style warfare, which, I'll be honest, sounds a lot better than doggy-style warfare. These wars likely either took place in resource hotspots like rivers, tribal villages, or luxury caveman real estate, such as a nice cave. If you think Vietnam-era guerrilla warfare is scary, imagine picking berries in a field somewhere around your village, and then out of nowhere, 200 cavemen incoherently yelling Baba Booey, getting ready to spank your sorry ass with a glorified paddle that would make your Bapsha's slipper feel like a down feather pillow. Doesn't sound fun to me. The Bronze Age. Now that we're in the Bronze Age, we certainly don't have to worry about a lack of evidence because this era has plenty of warfare to cover. In the Bronze Age, society began to see major civilizations starting to organize for the first time, and many historians view this as the dawn of warfare and conflict. Well, official warfare and conflict. As these societies grew more complex and organized, and especially without thousands of years of experience in trading and international business, when one civilization had resources that the other wanted, most leaders' best idea was just to wage war. What resources, you may ask? Well, to begin with, most of the Minecraft basics. Think land, metals, water, loot, and trade routes. Okay, trade routes aren't really in Minecraft, but you get the point. Anyways, quick tangent here, but most people don't consider the importance of rivers in ancient cities. Like all civilizations, rivers and access to water weren't just a want for a booming economy, they were a requirement.
I need it!
Rivers provided reliable access to scalable trade, drinking water, agriculture, and even seafood. And unlike most resources, you can't just trade a river. Thus, war was a natural consequence. One of the biggest wars that took place in the Bronze Age was the Battle of Kadesh. And by studying it, we can gain some insight into what war was like in this time period. But first, does anybody remember the story of Moses in the Bible? Well, the leader of the Battle of Kadesh was Ramses II, which is the same pharaoh from the story of Exodus in the Bible. Although it has been said this battle took place a couple decades before the time period of Exodus, when the pharaoh was younger and probably still better at fighting. You see, Ramses II wasn't happy with all of Egypt's L's in the past century, as Egypt was losing territory to its neighboring empires. So, like all ancient leaders who consider themselves to be gods, Pharaoh launched a wide-scale campaign to regain Egypt's lost territory to restore it to its former glory. Anyways, the Hittites didn't like this, so they made up their own army to counter the Egyptians heading for their land. This story gets long, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. Two Hittite spies lied to the Egyptians and told them that their army was far away. And for some reason, the Egyptians totally believed them. The Egyptian army set up camp to chill for a bit. And then, a little while later, the Hittites straight up ambushed them. With no time to prepare, the Egyptians had to improvise with their strategy on the fly. And in a matter of minutes, the Hittite army pretty much broke the Egyptian army into pieces. Now, once the Hittites saw that the army was broken up, they got greedy and started plundering the nearby enemy camps for that sweet Egyptian loot. Now, at this point, I'm guessing Ramses was feeling embarrassed and upset because somehow, against all odds, he escaped from the Hittites surrounding him and reunited with his army. This was probably possible because the Egyptians had lighter and more maneuverable chariots, which gave them a huge competitive advantage in battle over the Hittites' heavy chariots, which probably had the modern-day acceleration equivalent of a Mitsubishi Mirage. Now, I know all of this because Ramses II actually had hundreds of fanboys who sat around all day writing poems about him, like the ancient equivalent of a K-pop stan. Either way though, I respect the rulers in this time period because they actually fought with their army in the battles that they waged, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because no world leaders do that anymore. In the end, it was speculated that nobody really won this battle on either side. Apparently, the war created the world's first peace treaty though, which is pretty cool. If you were fighting a war at this point in history, you'd better hope that you had a good army, because without it, you'd probably be killed by a stray arrow in a matter of minutes. Now that we're no longer in the Stone Age, we have a significant upgrade in our weapons. When talking about weapons in this era, keep in mind that the invention of bronze armor and the bow and arrow changed warfare strategies significantly. For example, if you were a soldier in an ancient Egyptian war, you had to keep your eyes peeled for bowmen and flying arrows at all times. Warfare at the beginning of the Bronze Age was pretty similar to the end of the Stone Age. But even when they did come around to the invention of metal weapons such as the bronze axe, bronze did not always equal better. For example, for most of this time period, most societies still didn't make arrow tips out of bronze because bronze arrow tips were duller than obsidian and more expensive than bone arrow tips. Furthermore, they didn't want to bother spending money on an arrowhead that would probably end up never found again. And as far as other weapons went, a flint mace or axe blow was just as damaging as a strike from a copper one. Because of these reasons, copper knives and swords still coexisted alongside stone, bludgeons, and arrowheads for a long time in the Bronze Age. Warfare was much more organized and strategic than the Stone Age. Armies would use advanced melee formations such as the phalanx, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder using shields for protection and striking their enemies with spears and swords. I think we need to talk about how cool chariots were at this point. For example, in the Battle of Kadesh, chariots were a relatively new technology, only having been invented a couple centuries into the Bronze Age. Chariots were basically the world's first car, with only 2 horsepower. And just like modern day cars, chariot technology improved over time. For example, at some point in history, the lighter 2-wheel chariot was a new design that made it faster and more maneuverable than the earlier models. Also, keep in mind that chariots were considered the cool vehicle back then, and most normies in battle didn't even get one. In this era, fortified cities became more common, and with that came the dawn of siege warfare, where the enemies of your kingdom would use battering rams and ladders to try to bypass your city's defenses, and you would have probably been instructed to shoot them with bows and arrows or throw hot boiling oil and stones at them while they try to climb their ladders. Battles in the Bronze Age typically took place in plains and open fields. Was this because everyone became more civilized than simply resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics? No. The leaders of the battles probably just wanted to make sure that there was enough room to do victory donuts in their sweet new chariots after winning the fight. The Iron Age. Well, now we're in the Iron Age, and unsurprisingly, just like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is categorized by iron. Historians weren't really creative with making these names. In this time period, war was primarily fought over control of resources, as usual, although the definition of valuable resources changed slightly. You see, at every point up until now, fertile land and water was fought for. But now that most people had learned a thing or two about metal forging, valuable minerals like iron were in high demand. Add to this the fact that various religious sects were doing a not very good job at coexisting. While it isn't agreed upon how legitimate it was as an actual event, one famous war that supposedly took place in this time period and has pretty strong evidence for it happening was the Trojan War, a battle between Greece and Troy from the 12th century BC. This battle allegedly broke out after Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Talk about low, dude. Anyways, war in the Iron Age was categorized by double-edged iron swords, spears with iron tips, and even daggers. They used shields constructed of wood and leather, and metal maces. Ouch. Like the other time periods, they used advanced formations in war, making a turtle shell type shape with soldiers' shields. Defensively, cities were within very guarded walls, which might sound like a good idea until you realize that enemies could lay siege on you at any moment. And without water or food coming in, the odds of survival under siege got lowered every single day. Enemies of your city would even build towers to jump the wall, or tunnel under the wall to get within your kingdom. The Iron Age shared a lot of similarities with the Bronze Age, just with some minor and some major developments. The medieval era. In the medieval era, war was waged by monarchs and nobles to gain either political power or to expand their territory. If you've been following along in this video, you've probably noticed a common theme. One of the biggest wars in the medieval period was the Crusades, which in a nutshell were organized by Western European Christians after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. In the Crusades, the primary objective was to stop the expansion of the Muslim states and reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East for Christianity, and recapture previously Christian territories. During the medieval era, weapons advanced a lot. Notable weapons of this time period include longswords, lances, which could be thrown from far away, and the Morning Star, which is not as friendly as it sounds. This was a spiky ball on a chain that was designed for crushing knights' armor. Also, they didn't just have mere bows anymore. They had crossbows, which had a huge range advantage, and could even pierce a knight's plate armor. Trebuchets existed too, but unless you were an idiot who got in the way of the projectile path, or you lived in a city that it was being aimed at, they weren't really something to worry about. You could probably just run to the side of the field, and it wouldn't be able to adjust its aim fast enough. Battles in medieval times were not as chaotic as their depictions in movies and story. As one Redditor pointed out, if you stayed in your crowd, keeping your enemy only in front of you while being surrounded by your friends left, right, and behind, your chances of survival increased heavily. Disciplined and organized shield formations allowed smaller armies to hold off much larger forces than they should have been able to, with coordination and skilled teamwork. Additionally, a small group known as the Charge Cavalry, which consisted of heavily armored knights on armored horses, would break into enemy lines, allowing the rest of the army to seep into the cracks of the battle line in order to divide up the army into smaller groups. Men in most medieval wars throughout history were arranged in the most natural formation, also known as the line formation. The larger the battle is, the more important it was to keep the line together. Shock troops, which were knights with lances, swords, and shields, were intended to break enemy ranks and shatter the infantry. And that is why the battle formation we mentioned earlier were used. Keeping your shields tight to hold the line was the #1 determinant of whether or not you would lose a war. And believe it or not, this was a shock to me, evidence shows that the winners of medieval wars often suffered very minimal casualties. Siege was also an integral part of war at this time, with armies relying heavily on catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Another tactic that was used that we mentioned earlier was cutting off supplies to the castle that was being besieged. In reality though, medieval warfare was rough. Regardless of ideals of chivalry, the wars in the medieval era were just as or more savage than the ones from previous eras. This is because medieval times were still a transitional period to more structured forms of war. Early modern era. In this time period, military conquest was one way in which monarchs and empires looked to acquire new land and further spread their wings. Wars were fought for all the same reasons as the last, as well as fights for political power struggles between emerging dynasties and nation states, as well as the desire for economic trading dominance. Events such as the War of the Spanish Succession comprised one such cause. In this age, there were many skirmishes between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. Additionally, one famous war from this period was the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. The 30-Year War was one of the most catastrophic wars in European history. What started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire was soon enlarged into a border dispute involving some of the greatest powers in Europe. This war brought widespread famine, disease, and depopulation, especially in the German states. In 1648, the war finally ended with a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. What was war like in the early modern era? Well, the introduction and wide usage of gunpowder weapons pretty much defined war in the early modern era, muskets, cannons, and other firearms completely changed the nature of combat and rendered most medieval techniques, such as cavalry charges, completely useless. Many battles were characterized by vast formations of troops and a strategy known as the pike and shot, where musketeers fired a bunch of shots while pikemen protected them from enemy cavalry. So basically, it was spawn camping. Heavy artillery like cannons were mainly used in sieges because they could easily break through fortified city walls. Sieges were frequent, as many armies sought to take cities and fortresses of the most strategic importance, sometimes leading to long, exhausting standoffs. Like I mentioned, this time period saw the development of gunpowder weapons. The musket replaced both swords and bows as the primary infantry weapon. Cannons were also used in combat because of their ability to reduce fortifications, essentially destroying them from a safe distance. The first musket was the matchlock musket, but over time it was improved into the flintlock musket because flint was far more reliable. Gunpowder not only influenced the weapons, but also the battle styles of this time period. This change led to linear infantry formations where soldiers stood in a relatively long, straight line to have as much firepower from their muskets as possible. Cavalry units were still sometimes used, although the invention of muskets made soldiers way less privy to undergoing these strategies. And unlike the last era, urban warfare became much more frequent, as developed cities rose to political and economic prominence, like Vienna and Paris. Like mentioned previously, during sieges, food supplies would typically run low, and everyone, including soldiers and civilians, had to survive on whatever was available to eat. Thus, many of them resorted to eating rats, horses, and dogs, and in some cases, entire towns starved to death during extended sieges. The modern era and present day. Modern day, here we go. In the modern era, ideological confrontations came at the forefront of wars, especially during the Cold War, where the clash between capitalism and communism led to numerous proxy wars worldwide. New reasons for war and conflict included oil and other energy commodities and the drive for industrial power. Wars in the 19th and 20th centuries had many examples of disputes over nationalism, self-determination, independence movements, the American Civil War, and decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. Additionally, warfare in the 21st century saw the rise of terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies and regional grievances. The biggest war in the modern era, of course, was World War II. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, determined the fate of the modern-day world. This war was driven by expansionist ambitions, especially those from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Thus, it naturally clashed with the polar opposite ideologies of fascism and democracy. This war saw countless major battles reverberating throughout Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And as we all know, it ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the toppling of the fascist regime, which established the United States of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the transitional period into the Cold War. What was war like in the modern era? Modern warfare with today's advanced technologies includes firearms, tanks, aircraft, and missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. Contemporary wars use any number of variations in attack style, sometimes combining traditional military battle structure with guerrilla warfare.
They're in the tree!
And in the modern day, rifles and handguns are standard weapons to every soldier. Howitzers provide long-range firepower, and missiles, both cruise and ballistic, provide precision strikes against enemy targets. The invention of nuclear weapons opened an entirely new scale of destructive capability that changed the tide, context, and rules of war forever. Recently, cyber warfare tools have been added to the game as well, allowing enemy forces to intercept military secrets, gain intel, and even turn electricity off to enemies via EMPs. Additionally, drones have changed the game in modern battles, such as the FPV bombing drones currently being used in the Ukraine war. Besides this, for battles that take place in 2024, for the first time in history, it's pretty much a prerequisite to be fighting on air, land, and sea. Bonus: the future. This is a new one. In any of our time period videos, we have never covered on a hypothetical future, but for this video, I figured, why not try it out? With that being said, we've covered every era of history we know. What about the final era, the future era? Well, although I'm no time traveler, this is just fictional speculation, but in the future, it is possible that physical land and sovereignty will give way to fighting over digital control and power. In dictatorial countries, this would probably include power over free speech and the suppression of controversial information. Besides this, however, wars will be fought for many, many reasons. Because at this point, we've progressed so far that any reason we fought a war in the past will probably happen again. Future reasons for war, however, could also include future resources that we don't even know about yet. I'll leave you with a hypothetical to help paint the picture. Imagine the year is 2200. Nowadays, oil money is a thing of the distant past. Up until this point, the most sought after resource was lithium, but a recent breakthrough in supercapacitors makes them the new perfect storage for energy. They can be charged for a single second, last for weeks to months, and hold unimaginable amounts of power in a tiny amount of volume. Basically, basically like Tony Stark's nuclear reactor. After outstanding research reports were released from the once Ivy League Musk University, Elon Musk's research and innovation-oriented university founded in 2045, regarding this new invention, it was an absolute sensation around the world, and even more consequential than the invention of the light bulb. However, there's only one problem with this new technology. The new supercapacitor technology that everyone wants requires a rare mineral called potentia that is currently only found in a little island known as Mergui, formerly known as Fiji. In an interesting twist of fate, nuclear weapons have become completely obsolete, as long before Iran and Afghanistan gained power to nuclear weaponry in 2036, the United Nations pooled billions of dollars into research and development for nuclear defense weapons. The technology that came from this was able to deactivate any and all ICBMs by sending supersonic counter missiles at a nearly unlimited number of missiles. And by 2080, nearly all countries in the world have a nuclear iron dome of mutually assured protection. Because of this, and paired with the new breakthroughs in technology to counter radiation and EMFs, warfare reverts back to something like the World War II era of war, but still far more futuristic. In this warfare, close-range combat is relevant again, and ingenuity gives nations a competitive advantage. Thus, this new supercapacitor was the new holy grail for super advanced combat weapons. From looking back in history, we can conclude that a futuristic war for resources would be far different from the historical examples we've covered thus far. In fact, war might never get waged in the first place in this example, as advanced geospecific information warfare could be utilized first to either keep it from happening in the first place or brainwash the citizens of Mergui to uprise until their government makes a deal that's in favor of the country that's conducting the brainwashing. This is all a future hypothetical, but I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on it because I think this format could be kind of fun. How to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water, were your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age, on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement, and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now, in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore, your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this, shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically null and void because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development. And as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you are someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob with the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. For the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers at be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist. And serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag. The Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. For the sake of this story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do? Once again, you have 2 options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm gonna try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day one, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work, mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There is a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intention. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade, because they 1, have the most money, and 2, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they are going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside 2 rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm gonna pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just wanna know when's that money coming into town and what route is it gonna take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom, and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have two options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately. Unfortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money is going missing all the time, and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today. In good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we gonna get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now, I gotta get them. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road, drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government, the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm going to go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king unless I told him a reason not to. I'm going to tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete, and together, we set sail. On this boat, I am more or less useless, so I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation, essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped, so I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before, at least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in the story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I tell the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get the loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The modern era. Wow, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you'll be like, huh, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. A step-by-step plan on how you can get rich in every time period. This video was extremely fun to make, and like your mother, it was rather fast and loose. Not too many facts, but a lot of funny hypotheticals based on different circumstances of different time periods. Hopefully you guys like how humans got lifted in every time period. If you've watched our videos over the last few months, then you probably know about people's obsession with obscure chemicals. And typically Usually I'm not this coy with my verbiage, but YouTube's been giving me a real paddling lately, so I'm trying to be a good boy. With that being said, I've only really discussed chemicals people are taking in the modern day, but human consumption of obscure chemicals far predates even history itself. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the favorite concoctions of humans in every time period and how they use them to get high. Starting in the Stone Age. The Stone Age is one of the most interesting and mysterious time periods for substance consumption. Interesting because this is where it all started, and mysterious because of how unknown it really is. We have a rough idea of what exact plants were preferred during this time period, but we don't exactly know when they were first used or how often they were used at all. Some suggest that ancient humans dating back to our ape-like ancestors were using specific plants regularly, although there's rather limited archaeological evidence to support that, and others believe that the recreational consumption didn't begin until much later in human history, like roughly 10,000 years ago, which there is slightly more evidence for. But here's the thing, just because the evidence we have available to us shows that the earliest recorded consumption began around 8100 BC, it doesn't necessarily mean that's where it actually began. That's just all we have proof of. And unlike pottery, stones, or other artifacts, these organic compounds don't preserve well. With that being said, I know you guys come to trust me bro for only the most factual, historically accurate, nothing but the truth type content. No creative liberties or stretching of any truths. We're all facts here. So with that being said, we're gonna focus on the consumption after 10,000 BC, where the invention of farming, herding, and civilization likely facilitated the use of these compounds. Or I should really just say plants. At this point in time, they're just plants. They're not even, they're just plants. But if you did want to speculate about early use, feel free to drop a comment. I'd love to open that conversation. Okay, so now that we have a framework for the timeline, what were these people in the Stone Age, or at least from 10,000 BC and beyond, getting up to? What were they lighting up? What were they chooching on? What were they fiending for? Well, I'll tell you. For starters, cannabis seeds appeared in archaeological digs dating back as far as 8100 BC in Asia. Now, does that just mean that's when it was used? It's hard to tell because the evidence doesn't suggest that, although it is possible. What we do know, however, is that in China, there was strong evidence for ritualistic use of cannabis by 500 BC, which is obviously no longer in the Stone Age, so we'll touch on that later. What we do have evidence for not only consumption but also production of in the Stone Age is alcohol, specifically beer. By 10,000 BC, the Natufians have mastered the process of making beer. And although alcoholic beverages from this time period were significantly different than what we would consider to be modern day beer, the resemblance was there. Beer from 12,000 years ago had a rather low alcohol content of only 2 to 4%, and often contained additives such as fruit or honey, and most oddly, varied in consistency, from a clear liquid to a soupy mixture with floating solids and even pastes. Just imagine that. Beer soup with honey and fruit. Interesting. Researchers also suggest that there is a possibility that these people had also domesticated cereals, no, not the breakfast food, the actual grain category, for the specific purpose of brewing beer with them, instead of eating them. As strange as this early beer sounded, it actually served a dual purpose. Not only was it likely enjoyable for the people consuming it, but it also was a great alternative to water, as the alcohol in this soupy mess killed harmful bacteria that would have otherwise made these people sick. And this is going to be a trend throughout all of history, both brewing beer and also drinking alcohol to avoid dirty water. So while people in the Middle East were making beer, what was going on in North America? Well, actually a lot of things. Some of the primary and favored plants during the Stone Age were tobacco and coca. These were of course discovered and used by indigenous Americans, who not only liked their stimulants, but also had a particular fascination with psychedelics as well. Some of the available natural selection of psychedelics include peyote, morning glory, datura, salvia, ayahuasca, and over 20 different species of magic mushrooms. To me, it's no wonder that indigenous Americans were so spiritual. You could be on the prairies foraging for natural goods and come back with a basket full of 20 different types of psychedelic. Insane. One interesting tradition that the indigenous Americans had when it came to tobacco and some of these hallucinogens was nasal administration, specifically inhaling tobacco through your nose, which I can only assume must have hurt, but I guess to them it was enjoyable. They must know something we don't. One interesting piece of history is when the Spanish conquistadors visited the Mayan people, they were horrified by the Mayans' drug trips and saw it as the devil's work, which if you know anything about Mayan history, I don't fully blame them for that considering some of their traditions. For example, human sacrifices, skull towers, slaves made into skin suits. Stuff like that doesn't strike me as angelic per se. But however you look at it, psychedelics were a major part of development and tradition for indigenous American people. The reason why people would use these plants varies for most of the same reasons that people do even in this day. People are looking to either ease pain, experience a pleasant sensation, connect with a higher power, gods or lost loved ones, or simply provide them more energy to hunt hunt, work, and endure Stone Age life. One popular Stone Age plant that was used to serve all of these purposes was the coca leaf. The coca leaf was readily available and was easily consumed, primarily being mixed with lime and being chewed until they had a stimulant effect. At that point, they would spit out the leaves and do it all over again, with some people chewing the stuff all day long. Although the exact origins of specific usage isn't known, it is confirmed that some of the earliest traditions for mind-altering chemicals date back all the way to at least 10,000 BC, and some fan favorites include tobacco, coca leaves, and a bundle of psychedelics. And you can't forget beer soup. The Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really exciting because we have a lot more facts and a much larger variety of substances to cover. The plants we discovered in the Stone Age are still around, but we now have some new discoveries as well. One of the biggest and most impactful is opium. The opium poppy was first cultivated in Southwest Asia and is one of the oldest medicinal plants in recorded history. The first mention of the opium poppy was found on Sumerian clay tablets from about 3000 BC, near the very beginning of the Bronze Age. These tablets were found at the spiritual center of the Sumerians, located just south of Baghdad, and appeared to describe the cultivation of the opium poppy, including the collection of the poppy juice in the early morning, as well as the production of opium itself. The Sumerians literally named opium gil, or happiness, a term that is still applied to opium in certain cultures today. Pretty crazy how long this stuff has been around and how influential it was. It likely is one of the most influential plants on this list. Besides opium, archaeologists also discovered well-preserved strands of human hair in a 3,000-year-old burial site in Spain, revealing trace amounts of 3 different alkaloid substances associated with altered states. Now, they don't exactly know what these psychoactive substances were used for, but it is speculated that they were used for recreational purposes. Another huge innovation and entry into the lifted realm was wine. Early wine has actually appeared in Egyptian pictographs, and by the early Bronze Age, the pictographs actually showed the production of wine and beer as well. And they didn't just display it as some crazy thing, they showed it like it was business as usual. This stuff has been around. At the time, wine and other alcoholic beverages were not only used for pleasure, but they were also used for nutritional, medicinal, and religious purposes. Imagine if they advertised wine that way today. In 2600 BC, a Chinese emperor was actually studying the impact of alcohol on the public's health. He was curious why people did not live as long as they did before, and one of his people claimed, "Nowadays, people use wine as a beverage, and they adopt reckless and unusual behavior. They devote all their attention to amusement of their mind, thus cutting themselves off from the joys of a long life. Their rising and retiring is without regularity." It's crazy how even 5,000 years ago, alcohol was having a negative impact on people's lives, and today it's still popular as ever. At this time, China was really on some other stuff, because not only were they investigating the impacts of alcohol on the public, but they were also bringing to market some of the most influential medicines of all time. During the Bronze Age, Emperor Sheng Nong discovered a wide range of medicines almost 5,000 years ago. These included the first caffeinated tea and ephedra, which was used to make amphetamines. Emperor Sheng Nong prescribed tea for malaria, rheumatism, and poor memory. Caffeinated tea was also commonly an antidote to poisonous effects of other herbs. Ephedra was a natural stimulant that helped with asthma and was probably used for other things too. There's a reason that people still reference ancient Chinese medicine today. Even back in the Bronze Age, they were really on their stuff. Besides the discoveries of opium and amphetamines and wine, there was obviously a ton of development going on with tobacco, beer, and psychedelics. Tobacco was being traded and cultivated, beer production was being improved, and shamans were using psychedelics as a gateway to the other side. Definitely an interesting time to be around. Similar to the Stone Age, all of these substances had similar purposes, with a primary focus on religious and medicinal benefits, of course with some leisure mixed in there as well. The Iron Age. At this point, human development is ramping up to full speed, and honestly, a lot of the plants that we've discussed are still very much favored and very much so in use, with the only real difference being the scale of production and cultivation, as well as the documentation of their benefits and use cases. One of the most commonly cited plants that we see in the Iron Age is something you're likely familiar with. It may be something you're enjoying right now, that being cannabis. During this time in history, cannabis use was widespread, and use cases vary drastically, and some of them are kind of funny. In Mesopotamia, several clay tablets were found in a library that contained references to cannabis. Most of these references indicated the plants were used for either magical healing purposes or to drive away evil spirits or even illnesses, which is interesting. On the contrary, over in China, the use of cannabis in medicine was very early in its development. But according to a famous early book on Chinese herbal medicine, known as the Divine Farmer's Matura Medicina, cannabis, if taken in excess, will produce hallucinations, literally seeing devils. On the other hand, moderate use over a long time has benefits. If taken over a long time, it will make one communicate with spirits and lightens one's body. Definitely an interesting interpretation of the plant, and I feel like they were smoking some strong stuff. During this time, opium is also traded among the Silk Road. No, not that Silk Road, the actual Silk Road. And I think one of my favorite pieces of history from this time period is this. In the year 3 BC, there was a drinking contest in Greece that led to the death of 41 people. It is reported that a Greek drinking contest revealed that 41 contestants died of alcohol poisoning. Oddly enough, the winner did not die, at least not immediately. He actually took home prizes which included more wine, but he only lived for 4 more days before dying. Absolutely insane that there was drinking contests in 3 BC, and also the fact that so many people died at the same contest. That is wild. Near the end of the Iron Age, alcohol became the prominent psychoactive substance during the Roman Empire. Catholic Christianity became the state church of the Roman Empire, and since alcohol was often produced by abbeys and monasteries, it became the people's favorite. During this time, we weren't just limited to beer or wine. They also had introduced cider and mead as well. And it was also around 100 BCE when Rome had caught up with Greece in wine production and trade. One interesting artifact that was found in the Iron Age are stones carved into mini mushrooms by the Guatemalans. A set of 9 mushrooms was found that is believed to be associated with the 9 lords of the night and gods of the underworld. One study of these miniature sculptures suggests that these stones may have been used to grind up the mushrooms to prepare them for ceremonial consumption, which is cool, but it's also crazy that they also depicted 9 lords of an underworld on their mushroom carving. They must have been seeing some stuff. It was also at this time when Plato argued that alcohol is a good test of someone's character. Plato argued that drinking with someone is the simplest, fastest, and most reliable way to test someone's character. This is because wine stimulates the emotion, including desires or pleasures of questionable moral worth. So if you want to get to know someone else's character, or even your own character, according to Plato, get drunk. Interestingly, in Asia, the Persian king advised his army to take advantage of their opponent's lack of experience of alcohol to defeat them, and literally used feast and alcohol as a military strategy. The idea was if the Persians were able to provide their enemies with large, generous portions of lamb and large amounts of wine in which they had no experience with, they would become so infatuated with the feast and compelling feeling of this drink that they would be too distracted to even compete with the Persians in accomplishing great things. Definitely an interesting strategy. Chewing coca leaves was still popular as ever in the Iron Age, and they even discovered multiple ceramic figures depicting characters chewing coca leaves from 500 BC. So if you wanted to know how people got lifted in the Iron Age, the Greeks and Romans were literally turning into frat bros, drinking until they died. People in Asia were smoking until they saw the devil, and people in Guatemala were taking mushrooms until they saw the 9 lords of the underworld. I think the most normal thing to come out of this time period and their psychoactive substances is Plato's analysis on alcohol. It definitely was a funny time. The medieval era. One of the craziest substances we've talked about on this list is now about to be revealed. Technically, it was used at the end of the Iron Age and at the beginning and during the Middle Ages, but I wanted to add it here because this chemical is just so crazy and so insane. What I'm talking about, of course, is cacao, also known as chocolate. During this time, from roughly 250 AD to 900 AD, there was an abundance of physical and symbolic traces of cacao and chocolate left behind, specifically by the Mayan people. This evidence includes both physical evidence of cacao residue left on vessels, basically little pottery bowls and stuff, as well as cacao being mentioned directly on scriptures. It was believed that cacao was used for social, religious, and, once again, ritualistic factors, which is interesting. It kind of reminds me of like that live-action Charlie the Chocolate Factory movie, where they're in the forest with the Oompa Loompas, like when he first makes connection with them, and they're like having this religious connection to the cacao plant. It's basically like that. Maybe that's what it was inspired by. But yeah, the Mayans were loving their chocolate. Around 900 AD, we also see the first mention of coffee in print. This was found printed by a Persian physician in Iran. And it's interesting how long it took us to get from tea to coffee. But yeah, another crazy psychoactive substance. So far, they're just having the average morning meal. Nothing too crazy so far. The travels of Marco Polo from roughly 1200 AD noted that rice wine was actually more popular than grape wine in China, saying, quote, "Most of the people in China drink wine of a kind that I shall not describe. It is a liquor which they brew of rice with a quantity of excellent spice, in such a fashion that it makes better drink than any other kind of wine." I guess it kind of makes sense geographically why they would prefer a rice wine over a grape wine, but it's interesting that somebody who was used to grape wine actually preferred rice wine. He also made sure to note that, quote, "Rice wine makes one drunk sooner than any other wine." China was really just living it up at this time. They were smoking until they saw devils, and they were drinking until they could not anymore. Well, maybe not anymore. That was the Greeks. The Greeks were drinking to death, but China was probably in close second. It was around this time we also started to see the prohibition of certain substances, specifically cannabis in the Middle East. Wine and gambling at this time were explicitly prohibited in the Quran, but there was no specific text that gave guidance on hashish or cannabis. The general legal attitude was that cannabis should be banned despite the fact that it was widely used among Muslim populations. Occasionally, governments tried to take a drastic step against it, but with little success. From 1223 to 1277, there was a prohibition on wine and cannabis that involved the death penalty for those who used either. But it's noted that this prohibition didn't stop consumption and only caused the killing and maiming of people. So, although they were trying to get rid of wine and weed, one thing that they were ramping up production of was coffee. During this time, the first coffee trees were being cultivated on the Arabian Peninsula. And at first, coffee was used for medicinal and religious purposes, like many chemicals of this time. Funnily enough, the way that this was used for religious purposes was claimed that it would be used to help people stay awake during long religious ceremonies, which to me is hilarious because it's like, here, take this. This is going to be long and boring. But hey, if it works, it works. Honestly, medieval times seems like a pretty chill time with a lot of cool innovations like chocolate and coffee, and also some interesting attempts at prohibition. I think it's safe to say that at this time, the most common substance of choice was definitely alcohol, as its recreational use was ramped up significantly. I think one interesting example that showcases this pretty well is the fact that they used distilled spirits as a prescribed medicine during the Black Death. During the mid-1300s, distilled spirits were prescribed by doctors during the Black Plague, with the thought that it would help them fight off the disease internally. Ironically, this led to a lot of overconsumption of alcohol because people wanted to be extremely cautious, which is just kind of ironic and hilarious to think that people would be chugging essentially medieval vodka to help protect them from a extremely deadly disease. I guess at that point, if you're gonna go out, at least go out happy. Medieval times, dope. The early modern era. The early modern era is an extremely exciting time for people enlightening themselves, specifically because there is so much recorded evidence of different use cases, prohibitions, legalizations, declarations, and other recorded events associated with different psychoactive chemicals. And spoiler alert, there's not a ton of new introductions. However, the use cases of the chemicals and plants that we've described so far have definitely taken a change and now have adapted some interesting relationships with different cultures. For starters, in 1475 AD in Turkey, the world's first coffee shop was opened, which is really cool to think that coffee shops have been around for so long. Over in Europe, the introduction of the printing press has allowed a broader distribution of information about alcohol, which is a huge win for safety. For a short period of time, coffee was actually banned in Mecca, as it was claimed to be an intoxicant, and the governor of Mecca actually shut down all of the coffee houses, although shortly after his superior overruled him and opened them back up. Excitingly, cacao had made its way over to Europe, first at Spain and then the rest of Europe. The first official voyage of cacao got delivered from modern-day Mexico to modern-day Spain in 1585, and at the time, cacao was served as a drink. Also at this time, smoking was introduced to the Europeans from indigenous Americans. Initially, Spanish friars in the Caribbean and Mexico believed that tobacco was the devil's weed, and the traditional indigenous smoking of it was sinful. However, French and English voyagers took note of the practice of smoking tobacco and brought the idea back home to Europe, where it quickly spread across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. It's almost hard to imagine Europe without tobacco at this point. Shortly after the popularization of tobacco, once again, during the plague, physicians were recommending tobacco as a disinfectant, and even stated that people who smoked tobacco regularly had lower rates of infection. And one of the funniest things is that Pope Clement VIII declared coffee as a Christian drink, specifically because most people associated it with Islamic culture, because it was brought to Europe by traders from the Middle East. It's stated that Pope Clement tried coffee for the first time and then decreed it as a Christian drink, which is kind of hilarious. Could you imagine being a trader from the Middle East, bringing a gift to the Pope, sharing your culture with him, watching him try it for the first time and seeing the delight on his face, only for him to instantly decree, yes, this is great. This is a Christian drink. Thank you so much for this Christian drink. And they're like, actually, we've been, you know what, sure. Crazy, but times were different. During this time, prohibitions are popping up and down everywhere, and coffee houses are exploding. Not literally, just they're getting popular. Maybe a few exploded, I don't know. In 1663, English coffee houses were actually required to be licensed. And in 1676, the first coffee house opened up in Boston. And believe it or not, it wasn't a Starbucks. During the 30-year War, Dutch soldiers kept bottles of what was known as Dutch courage on their belt, which was actually a flask of gin. During these battles, the British actually took note and began doing the same thing as well, which I don't blame them. If I was in a war that was 30 years long, I think I'd be sipping a little bit too. Tobacco prohibition was happening in both Russia and Japan, although in Japan it was relatively short-lived. So yeah, during the early modern era, the legendary combo of coffee and cigarettes was booming, essentially all over the world. And although some people wanted to ban it, there was really no way to go about it, as the trade was booming, and people wanted their caffeine and nicotine. bad. It's so interesting to see the first discovery of a plant and then worldwide stores selling a product made from this plant pop up in the matter of 100 years. That's just, to me, so cool to see. Humans are honestly awesome, and that's why I love these time period videos. But we're still not done yet. The modern era. One of the first and most significant events that took place was the London gin craze. The English took their interest in Dutch courage a little bit too far, because now, after the king and parliament encouraged the production of gin to increase the price of grain and provide tax revenue, this resulted in the price of gin dropping dramatically, which exponentially boosted the consumption, particularly among the poor. Now that the gin was so cheap, any regular old person could afford to maintain a solid buzz 24/7, and this was causing havoc among the British people. I think there was a lot of reasons to drink during the early 1700s, especially in London. Religious dissent, rebellion, corrupt politicians, displaced people, all factors that were contributing to an unstable society. People were packed in tight, small, dirty rooms. Living and working conditions sucked. Most people were poor, so if there was any sort of joy or escape that you could afford, why wouldn't you? The upper class blamed the production of gin for all of the issues that British society was having, but realistically, the consumption of gin was only because of how low the quality of life was at this time. The government did eventually begin to control the gin craze through a series of what was known as gin acts. That alone is a pretty crazy start to the modern era. In 1832, a French chemist was the first person to isolate codeine, which is an alkaloid of the naturally occurring opium that at this point has been used for hundreds of years. Codeine is still widely used today, and in modern times is synthesized from morphine through a chemical process. Moving over to China, Emperor Yang Cheng prohibited the sale of opium for smoking. It was still legal to use medicinally, but if you were using it recreationally, you were killed. Although this didn't really have an impact on any of the trade routes or consumption because officials were for the most part corrupt, and the demand and supply chain was stronger than the government could keep up with. A separate French chemist also discovered morphine, which, like codeine, comes from the opium plant and is still used heavily to this day. And during the early 1800s, it was prescribed by physicians often for pain relief. But by the 1870s, physicians began to express concerns because of the morphine habit that it was causing, which is, of course, a pretty severe addiction. In 1869, the Prohibition Party was established in the United States of America, which was essentially looking to achieve widespread social reform about alcohol, and wanted to have legislation that would prohibit the sale and manufacturing of alcohol in the US. And seemingly one by one, countries began to prohibit different substances for different reasons. It's also at this time that we see a lot of interesting companies pop up. For example, Folgers Coffee Company was founded in 1850. Miller Brewing Company was founded in 1855. Lipton Tea was established in 1890. And Coca-Cola was invented in 1886. Besides companies popping up, we also see a lot of drugs popping up. We saw amphetamines being introduced. We saw LSD synthesized in the late 1930s. We saw oxycodone first synthesized in the 1910s. And in the 1940s, people in Japan got their first taste of meth. I wonder where they got it from. What were Japan and Germany up to in the 1940s? The modern day is honestly a super interesting time because we see the industrialization of all of these compounds that, for the most part, have been around for hundreds and thousands of years. And not only do we see a lot of companies pop up, but we also see a lot of legislation, specifically regarding to temperance and regulation. And we also see the first introduction of a lot of synthetic, or at least processed chemicals that we now would consider to be pharmaceuticals. It's truly crazy how fast things have developed. And I guess these are all more or less of a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, which I would consider to be a huge landmark in civilization and human history as a whole.